finally have arrived at the point in the class when we get to talk about the prophets, right? When we actually get to tackle some of these head on. So I'm going to present today on Amos. If we have time, we'll get to Hosea. And hopefully, this presentation will give you guys a good idea of what your presentation should look like. I think all of you have the prophet form out in front of you. I'm going to work loosely from that. So, as we're speaking about this, I'll probably jump around a little bit. I definitely want to lay out the setting first for us to kind of get our minds in that space, and then we'll move on into kind of the ways that Amos very much exemplifies these later prophets, right? Either the major or the minor prophets. The ways that he exemplifies what it is to be a prophet, and the kind of forms that he uses, how he speaks, and what he says. So, just to to get a quick look, this is the Nevi'im section of the Torah as it's laid out in the Tanakh. Okay, so as we see here, the former former prophets that we had, and then here we have the major and the minor, and these are laid out more or less. The latter ones are laid out both by size and by chronology. Okay, so we see here Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel are in chronological order. Okay, Isaiah here is going to be dealing with the Assyrians, Jeremiah with the Babylonians, and Ezekiel in exile. Right, and the rest of these kind of follow that same order as well. Okay. So this is the order that we have the Nevi'im in. So this just kind of gives us a good overview of how these books are ordered within the Torah. Yeah.
You said they're labeled by chronologically and what else?
And by the right. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are the major prophets, and they are long books. Okay. Hosea through Malachi are shorter books. They're called the minor prophets. They oftentimes get referred to as the Book of the 12, since these are 12 minor prophets, and their books are much smaller. So, for example, I think in the commentaries you guys have, whoever is doing Nehemiah and Haggai, or Zechariah and Haggai, will find it in a section called the Book of the 12. So, like I said, Amos is a model. Yeah, sorry. Do you have a question before? You good? Amos is very much a model prophet for us. So let's kind of explore a little bit the setting that he's coming into. Now look at your prophet timeline if you have one in front of you. Is the time for Amos going to be a time that we have already somewhat dealt with? Or is Amos happening after everything that we've talked about through Kings?
You mean like within what we're talking about now?
Yeah, so we've talked about everything. Think of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. Are we going back a little bit? Or are we continuing with this timeline after Kings?
Yeah, it's kind of like in transition.
No, it's after. Is this the fall of Israel?
During, yeah.
Why do you say during?
It's before exile.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I said. At first you didn't answer me. I said in the middle.
Sorry. Yeah, this is going to be during. So we're going to have to kind of back up our timeline a little bit. Get back into the time that we're talking through, mostly through Kings. Okay? And get our minds back there because the Assyrians have not yet invaded during Amos's and Hosea's time. Okay? And so if the Assyrians haven't invaded, obviously the Babylonians haven't invaded, so on and so forth, right? So we're kind of rewinding here to some of the stories and the times that we were reading about in Kings. So in Amos's time, we actually have a very prosperous Israel. Okay? Obviously, we're going to be dealing with Israel and Judah because this is after the split in 922, right?
Yes.
And we have Jeroboam the second here in the north and Uzziah in the south. And they're both very much extending their kingdoms, right? And there's relative peace between the two kingdoms as well. They're not fighting with each other. They're kind of just expanding. Assyria right now is a little weak. There's kind of a weak guy on the throne, which is allowing Israel to come up and conquer this land as well. Right? So we've got a lot of wealth and a lot of prosperity. There's a trade route called the King's Highway that runs through this region that Israel is in control of. Okay? So being in control of a major trade route, you're obviously going to do fairly well. Okay. So we have a lot of prosperity. And what ends up happening is that the people during this time end up attributing this prosperity, as most people do, to God being on their side. Right? They're doing everything well. God is blessing them. Right? There's all this expansion happening. Obviously, God is happy. Right? And there's all this new wealth kind of coming into Israel, and that's kind of also impacting cultic life. Right? People are somewhat going to temple more. There's a lot of shrine attendance. There is the kind of donations and offerings that are presented at the shrines are becoming, are happening more and more. And so there's this kind of wealth that's flowing into cultic life. But obviously, and I think, our times are no different than Amos's times would be, oftentimes with wealth comes corruption. Right? The more wealth that flows through a system, the more corrupt it's likely going to be. And that's kind of what Amos starts seeing. Okay. Now what's interesting is Amos is from the south. He claims to be from a little town down here in Judah named Tekoa. And yet he is a prophet to the northern kingdom. Okay. Almost the entire book of Amos is prophecies concerning Israel. Okay. He says he is a shepherd and a herdsman from Tekoa who tends sycamore trees. So he's getting fruit from these sycamore trees and watching sheep and cattle and whatnot. It's difficult to say whether this is actually the case or not. And I say that because from reading Amos's book, he seems to be a very well-educated individual. Right? So it's difficult to kind of align him saying, I'm this backwoodsy guy from the middle of nowhere, and at the same time, I'm a fairly well-educated person who's very much acquainted with cultic life in Israel and Israel's religious history and so on. He also distances himself from the prophetic tradition, which is really interesting. He has this famous line, I am neither the prophet nor the son of a prophet. Right? And so what's interesting is that we see with Amos, he's distancing himself both from the social life that would have been in the cities and from the religious life of the prophets. Right? He's saying, I'm separate from this. And this may be because he's going to be speaking so harshly against them. Right? He's going to be speaking so harshly against the middle and upper classes and speaking very harshly against the people who run the temples and the shrines and everything. Okay. Now remember in Israel too, we have our shrines at Bethel and our northern shrine. I can't remember the name. Shechem. What's that? Huh? Not yet. It's up here. I can't remember the name of it. We'll also see in Amos, he will refer to Samaria. I can't quite see it on this map because it's blurry. Oh, here it is. Samaria, which is the capital of the northern kingdom. Okay. So his prophecies are mostly going to be around these two locations. Okay. So you've got this southern religious location, and just above that, the political kind of epicenter for Israel. Okay. Let's see here. What's interesting too with Amos, and we'll kind of see this more as we'll get in, is typically in prophetic books, as I'm sure you guys are starting to notice, there's this call narrative. Right? There's this whole kind of elaborate story where Yahweh calls the individual to be a prophet. Right? But we don't get that in Amos. There is no story in Amos about Amos being called, right? There's no kind of narrative where Amos is called to be a prophet. And that may be part and parcel with him saying, I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. Right? Again, both in saying that, distancing himself, and even in the form of the book, not including this little narrative where he's called, also distancing himself from this kind of prophetic tradition. that he may see as corrupt, right? As kind of being that yes man. Remember we talked about those court prophets kind of just being yes men. The king's like, oh, should I go invade the land and expand Israel? And the prophets are like, oh yes, the Lord told me so, right? So again, here we see Amos maybe distancing himself from that, even in just leaving out that whole call narrative, which is really interesting. Now, with Amos, we have a lot of oracles, right? Oracles, like we talked about the other day, is one form that we'll see a lot in the prophetic books. Right? We talked about woe oracles and salvation oracles and these kinds of things. So we're kind of moving into the text here a little bit. Right? There's something that all prophets are going to use a lot, and we see it very clearly in Amos, and that's something called messenger speech. How would it's kind of that phrase that we talked about, how would messenger speech go? Right, yeah, good. So messenger speech is just something that says, thus says, right? And obviously for the prophets, it's going to be the Lord, right? But if you're a messenger coming from, say, your master in the neighboring town, you would go over and say, just thus says Jotham, my master, blah, 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 and deliver this message, right? So by saying thus says, you're saying these aren't my words. These are somebody else's words. Right? And this is all over the place in Amos. Right? This kind of messenger speech. Now there's a couple other things that Amos is kind of known for. One is for this really fun little saying, for 3 sins and for 4. Right? Implying, and for 4 sins. Right? And he goes on and says, this punishment will happen, right? There's a couple different ways of kind of seeing this, 3 being kind of this symbolic number, and then like adding 1 on top of it, right? These 3, I mean, like think about how oftentimes we see just 3 in our culture. How many times 3 pop up? What would be some examples?
3 lights on the stoplight.
3 lights on a stoplight. What?
3 strikes and you're out.
3 strikes and you're out.
3 wishes.
3 wishes. 3 wishes. There's what is it? There's the 3 little pigs, right?
Yes.
3 musketeers, right? That number pops up a lot, right? So saying there's 3 and for 4, right? They've gone over and beyond sinning, right? For the 3 sins and for 4. And another way of looking at it is that they equal 7, right? This like kind of complete list. Either way, he's very much emphasizing just the how much Israel is replete with sin. Now this section, when he is saying for 3 and for 4, is included in this section called Oracles Against the Nations. Okay. Now, when he gives these oracles against the nations, it's kind of difficult to say what is native to Amos's speech and what is maybe added later. Remember we talked about when we were talking about prophetic speech, seeing it as this very keen insight into a situation. And so when people come along later, they're like, oh man, this keen insight that Amos said here very much applies to our situation, right? And it's not this unholy thing to kind of add in your little situation to that text, right? In the same way that Amos said these things against the northern kingdom, we can say these things against the southern kingdom too, right? So, and the reason I say that is because Amos goes around, and it's kind of outlined here, you can't really see them, but he kind of hops around these different nations, or these different people groups surrounding Israel, saying, woe against you people, woe against you people, woe against you people. And he goes all around, and you notice here there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? There's 6. This is a very common thing to do in prophetic literature, right? Woes against the nations, right? And this is gonna kind of get people on Amos's side, right? Think about somebody coming along in the U.S. and how much people would get riled up if they said, woe against Russia, woe against Afghanistan, woe against Syria. You'll be like, yeah, those people, right? Yeah. But then what Amos does is then he calls out Judah And then, remember he's in Israel, then he calls out Israel.
Oh, he's in trouble.
Right? It's debated whether or not the Judah oracle is native to Amos's thought, because he is overall very much concerned with Israel. Judah's not really his concern, but for some reason he calls out Judah, predicts like its downfall. So this might have come later. This might have been a later addition, because if we think of this kind of numerically, which he seems to be kind of working with, the 6 and the 3 and the 4, we have 6, and then the 7th is Israel, right? So it's almost like leading up to, like if you guys ever listen to music, like most people you have, you notice that it's in 4/4, right? Do we have any music majors?
Yeah.
Right? When you listen to a song, you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right?
Yeah.
Having something stop at 6 would be almost like having something stop at a 7 in music, right? If you've ever listened to anything in 7/8, it's really weird. It's really jarring because it feels like it stops short. Right? There's 1, 2, 3. It's like you say 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 1 and 2 and. Sorry, no, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. It'd be 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. 1 and 2. Right? You would start that little and after the 4.
Yeah.
Right? That would be like stopping at 6. So everybody's kind of expecting, oh, what's the 7th going to be? Right? They're waiting for that second shoe to hit. Right? And that's where he hits Israel. Right? If we include Judah, it still kind of works. You have the 7th is like, oh, okay, that's everybody, yeah. And then he calls out Israel. So it still kind of works that way. I don't think it's as effective as if we think about it in a 6 and a 7. But either way, calling out Israel would be this kind of like unexpected thing to do, to call out your own people once you've hit all these nations surrounding you. But that's exactly what Amos does. And the reason he does it, what he calls Israel out for, is very different than what we've seen up to this point. Because remember, when we've been talking about Israel being called out for being unfaithful, in the Deuteronomistic history, right, we talked about idolatry. Amos doesn't really bother with this much. What Amos bothers with, and what a lot of other prophets talk about, is injustice. Okay, and we're going to come back to that in just a second. I want to talk a little bit more about some of the fun kind of prophetic tactics that Isaiah does as far as switching expectations. If somebody has their text in front of them, let's look at chapter 4 in Amos. Amos chapter 4. Who's got that open? Yeah. Yeah, just I'll tell you when to stop. We're going to start with.
Hear this word.
Yeah, go and start with that.
Hear this word, cow of
Bashan.
who are on Mount Samaria, who oppresses the poor, who crushes the needy, who say to their husbands, bring something to drink. The Lord God has sworn about his holiness. The time is surely coming upon you, when you shall take, that they shall take you away with hooks. Even the last of you with fish hooks. Through breaches in the wall you shall lead.
Okay, good. Hold up there. All right. We in our modern world don't really get the twist that's going on here. Read maybe, I'll tell you when to stop. Read, just start with 4:1 again. Yeah, he says, woe to you, the cows of Bashan.
Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on Mount Samaria.
Good. Okay. So Mount Samaria, remember we're talking about Samaria, this is the capital, right? So we're talking about urban elite here, right? And cows, we hear that and you think, oh man, if you tell somebody they're a cow, like you can expect to get hit, right? This is a positive thing to call somebody, right? think about how we talked about horns as being kind of symbolic of power, this kind of thing. When Amos starts talking and says, you cows of Bashan, remember we're dealing with a people who very much rely on livestock. These are, if you have cows rather than just sheep or goats, you're probably more wealthy, right? He's complimenting them out of the gate. You cows of Bashan, you sit on the hills in Samaria. It wouldn't be hard for ancient listeners to hear him and expect him to the next day, you are so wonderful and so beautiful, and you shower your riches upon us, right? That would easily flow from how Amos is starting, right? But then he turns it, right? And he starts saying, you who oppress the poor, and this kind of thing. And then he says that you'll be led out with hooks, right? So you get this image of carcasses being hung up by hooks, right? So he takes this compliment. You're this wonderful cow, this symbol of power and beauty and wealth, and he says you are no longer just this cow. You're pretty much a carcass, right? And he kind of gives this imagery of being. It says let out through the cracks in the walls, right? So what Amos is kind of saying here is that there is so much injustice in Israel, right, that Israel will fall. And this is a really weird thing to hear, right? In other words, he is placing the blame on Israel for an attack that Israel doesn't think is going to come. Remember, Israel at this time is expanding. The Assyria right now, not that big of a threat, right? It's going to become a bigger threat. We'll see Isaiah very much saying, whoa, hey, this is, watch out. But during Amos's time, this threat is very much just beyond the horizon. Okay? And by referring to being led out through cracks in the walls, remember we're dealing with walled cities during Amos's time, right? So if you are being led out through the cracks in the wall, it's because your city has fallen. Right? Especially if we're dealing with Samaria, this capital city, it's very much going to have walls. And if you're being led out as carcasses through these walls, then Samaria and therefore Israel has fallen. Good. So here's another way, just as in this 6 and 7 kind of thing, that Amos kind of turns your expectations. And this is a frequent prophetic tactic to play on people's expectations. And the other one I want us to point us to, because it's important that we understand kind of the context and how people would be hearing things, is the phrase day of the Lord. Let me see if I have my first reference. I do. Okay, if somebody else can turn to chapter 5 and read maybe just verse 18. Jackson, you got that?
Oh, in Amos? Yeah. Alas, for you who desire the day of the Lord, why do you want the day of the Lord? It is darkness, not light.
Good. Okay. Now notice this. He doesn't just come out and say the day of the Lord is darkness, right? Everybody knows this. He says, woe to you who desire the day of the Lord, who long for the day of the Lord. Right? That's a little hard for some of us to hear who are kind of acquainted with this terminology in Scripture. But for many Israelites, the day of the Lord was the day of Israel's vindication. Okay? It's when all these other nations around them would be put in their place. Israel and its people would be vindicated, no longer abused or conquered, but God would come out and justify and exonerate and promote Israel. Right? The day of the Lord, in the popular mindset, is a very positive thing. But what Amos does, and what a lot of the prophets are going to do, is say, this is not going to be a day of light. It's going to be a day of darkness. Read 19 and 20.
As if someone fled from a lion and was met by a bear, or went into the house and rested a hand against the wall and was bitten by a snake. It is not the day of the Lord darkness, not light, and gloom with no brightness in it.
Right. As if someone was running, what does it say, running from?
Running from a lion and then ran into a bear.
Right. You're running from one thing and you're met with something worse, right? You're resting on a wall after running and there's a snake, right? So this is not going to be a day of rest for you. You're not going to escape your troubles. You're going to run into worse ones. Right? This is how Amos is playing with this concept of the day of the Lord. Israel's not going to just escape that lion that's pursuing them because God's going to take care of them. No, God is going to be that bear that is going to meet them. Right? To look really quick, let me see. I think it's in chapter 7 or 8. Amos has these visions, and visions play a big part for the prophets as well. They see these visions, and sometimes they'll interpret them, sometimes they don't. When they don't interpret them, it's very frustrating. You have my sympathy, people who are doing Ezekiel. Because many of those visions are kind of left uninterpreted.
I read like this one thing about like his crazy stuff that he does or whatever, and like there's like been several things that I've read that said he's like schizophrenic or something.
Yeah, there's these like kind of psychological takes on him. If you are a believer in UFOs, you can watch the History Channel and get validation there. I kid you not, please do not ever take anything the History Channel says as fact.
Knights Templar.
Yeah. No, they had this whole shtick. I remember seeing it just being so frustrated that they were talking about Ezekiel's visions as being evidence that he had seen a UFO. It was just really, really awful.
Have you ever saw artist renderings of the visions that he had?
Yeah, they were really crazy. It's really crazy. But again, this is that tendency we have to read things very literally and not giving them that figurative space to breathe, right? And so when we try to actually artistically construct these visions, they end up being really bizarre. And that's part of what the prophet is going for, is like creating this bizarre imagery. But it's also incredibly symbolic, and we kind of lose the ability to let it be symbolic and reference things. If we just say no, like he saw like 4 wheels with hands and feet and all this kind of stuff, we lose that symbolic power. So in these visions, the one I want to point us to is the one where he says a summer fruit, where God shows him summer fruit.
Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. What is? Can you use that voice again, Felicia? Since you have it right there.
It says, "This is what the Lord God showed me: a basket of summer fruit." He said, "Amos, what do you see?" And I said, "A basket of summer fruit." Then the Lord said to me, "The end has come upon my people Israel."
Okay.
I remember.
Good. That's good. Sorry. So for us reading this in English, this is really bizarre, right? God says, "Hey Amos, what do you see?" And Amos is to see a fruit basket, right? And God's like, "Exactly. The end has come upon my people." Amos is like, "No, I don't really get what you're saying." Not the banana. They're like, "No idea." Right?
Isn't it that summer fruit actually perishes while fall we can start holding it?
Oh wow, that's
A
neat.
little bit. It's more of a play on words, and some of the translations have tried to work with that kind of idea of fruit rotting, and said like, "Thus the time is ripe for my people." What's kind of going on here is this is a play on word. The summer fruit is, if I can spell it, this is going to be a little off. Is kayit, and the word for end that's used here is ket. Right. So this is play on words. Right. It's almost like, just to kind of go back to the beam example, it's like, Amos, what do you see? I see a beam of light. Thus Yahweh says, "Thus I will beam my people in the head," right? For being unjust, right? It's a play on words here that Amos is using. It's this kayit and this ket, right? I see a kayit, thus there is a ket for my people, right? So there's this kind of wordplay. It happens earlier in Amos 3, verses 2 and 3, where God says, trying to remember this passage, that he knows his people, and then there's this idea, he says, like, when two people don't go out walking together unless they've made an appointment, right? And you have this, to know is ya'av, and to make an appointment is yada. So these words being really close together. So this wordplay will pop up a lot in poetry as well. Now it's interesting, kind of jumping back to this basket of summer fruit idea, or just to that whole section. What we see here is another role that prophets play. We saw this with Moses too. You know, remember he gets called the first prophet. Is this role of an intercessor. Because the first two visions that God shows Amos says, don't do this, the people will perish. And the text says that God relents or repents. Right? God changes his mind. After showing Amos this thing, and Amos says, no, like the people are not, you're just going to kill everybody. Like they won't be able to stand if you do this. And God relents. Interestingly enough, you know, vision 3, 4, and 5, Amos doesn't say anything anymore. Right. Amos is maybe seeing like, okay, if I keep, you know, objecting, it's only going to get worse. So we'll just stay with what we've got, right, with the lot that Israel is left with. Yeah. One that we don't see in Amos, but that I want to bring up, and I think we talked about it a little bit before, is called the Riv, or Reed in Hebrew. And this is a covenant lawsuit. Right? We talked about this a little bit before. Right? God bringing a lawsuit against the people. In Hosea 4:1 it says this, hear the word of the Lord, you Israelites, because the Lord has a charge to bring against you who live in the land. There is no faithfulness, no love, no acknowledgement of God in the land. Right? That's the charge. And then it'll go on through those kind of legal proceedings. So the Riv is this legal metaphor, this legal form the prophets will often employ, and where God brings a charge against the people. Amos doesn't make use of it, but Hosea definitely does. So, let's turn back to this theme, this kind of major theme that we see in Amos of injustice. Right? This is a huge switch from the perspective of the Deuteronomistic historians that we've been looking at, where all this focus is on the temple. I think if we start from a very key verse, it's going to help us kind of understand. So you see on your handout here in the message and theology, there's a key text, Amos 5:21 through 24. If somebody can read that from a text. Yeah, Lefty, you want to do that one? 5:21. Actually, focus on verse 21, I think. 5:21, yeah.
I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn symbols. Solemn symbols. Even though you offer me your burnt offering and grain offerings, I will not accept them. In the offering or well-being of your faded animals, I will not look upon.
Good. Keep going through 24, actually.
Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream.
Perfect. So you see here in Amos this really interesting shift where God is rejecting Israel's worship because it is unjust. Right? Everything in the DH that we've looked at has been saying, if a king centralizes worship in Jerusalem, if there is proper worship in Jerusalem, then things go well for the nation. What we see with the prophets is that the nation's well-being and the nation's success does not rest on centralized worship. It rests on morality. It rests on justice. And that is very new for the prophets. And that's going to be the voice of the prophets, by and large, throughout the prophetic books. You'll have some prophets that will kind of hark back to idolatry. Actually, Hosea is one of them. They very much kind of attacks the idolatry of the northern kingdom. But by and large, the prophets focus on this injustice and tying up national prosperity and national security with how just they are, right? Whether they're looking out for the poor, the widow, the orphan, right? Because Amos says, not only is God not listening to all your worship, but it's for this reason, because you are unjust, that you will be invaded, right? That God has control over these other nations and will use them to punish you for your injustice. Right? And this is a very new kind of thing we're seeing. And Amos doesn't pull any punches. Everybody pretty much is guilty in Amos's eyes, right? The middle class, the wealthy, the priests, everybody's guilty in Amos's vision. So let me see here. We'll also see too. You remember how we were looking at the Deuteronistic history when it talked about idols? It very much caricatured them, right? You guys know caricatures, like the silly faces that people draw of you, and it's like blows things out of proportions to kind of accentuate things, right? So when the DH talked about idolatry, there was a lot of like, oh, you're worshiping like a piece of wood, and obviously for people in the ancient Near East, like, no, we're not worshiping the piece of wood. We're worshiping like the God who's being represented and manifested in this piece of wood. But from the perspective of the DH, they're going to say, no, you're just worshiping the wood. Amos and a lot of other prophets caricature cultic life, right? They make it look silly and stupid because that's their perspective. They make cultic life out to be incredibly empty because from their perspective, there is no justice, and if there is no justice, then anything you do religiously, cultically, is empty. Does that make sense? Cool. It'd be almost like saying, oh, look, I have a balloon, and it's like inflated, right? Amos and the other prophets are going to say, unless you inflate that thing, it's not really a balloon, right? You can call it a balloon, but it's kind of just this floppy piece of, I guess, plastic. Is that what they're made out of? Latex, yeah, right? Amos and the other prophets are going to say, no, like, unless there is justice filling up this thing, filling up the land, in other words, any kind of worship is just this flimsy little deflated balloon. All right, that's going to be their kind of caricature. Now, another word I want us to kind of remember when we deal with the prophets here, this is a new fun word, is eschatology. Nice fun one. Eschatology. And eschatology is pretty much an account of the end. Okay. This is what the prophet is referring to with the day of the Lord. Right? For a lot of Israelites, the day of the Lord is this eschatological event where Israel is vindicated. For Amos, the day of the Lord is an eschatological event where Israel is judged. So we have in the prophets, there's this kind of, this is very much, eschatology is very much a looking forward. Right? Remember we talked about this whole idea of, prophets as having this keen insight, like your friend has a keen insight into a relationship and says, if you keep doing this and this is what's going to happen. Right? This is kind of how this eschatological view starts, saying, if you keep doing what you're doing, the end for you is going to be judgment. What we'll see as we progress through the prophets is this eschatology almost gets a little separated from that, starts to kind of have its own personality. And when we get finally into Daniel, we'll see just a whole account that's totally concerned, or totally from the perspective of this eschatological end. Right? But for Amos, when we're thinking about Amos, this eschatology is very much connected to the present, right? This end, this day of the Lord, is very much connected to their present injustice.
Is that why, I guess Christians nowadays kind of get into the old prophecy and what they're saying in books like Daniel, and that's how the end of the world is going to be, and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's all eschatological.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is there, like what you're saying, that's all, what they're saying is relevant to the people at that current time. There's no weight on it today, right?
Right. because remember, you know how we talked about creation, like the creation of the world is also kind of this way of talking about the creation of Israel. The end for Israel is also kind of this way of talking about the end of the world, right? In the end, right, in the eschaton, from the popular mindset, Israel will be vindicated. God will say, yes, these are my people. We'll put down all the other nations, right? So the end for Israel is also kind of, in a sense, the end for the other nations, right? Amos is going to flip that and say, so you can't really, in the prophet, separate, just have an end of the world, right? This cosmic end, without talking about what that looks like for Israel, right? Because that's totally centered on Israel. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
Cool. Is anybody kind of lost with that?
I actually have one more question.
Sure.
Okay, so you know how like you said people would add on to the books to have it make more sense or be more applicable?
Yeah.
Well, you know how Amos was focused more on Israel? I was just curious, like, do you think that maybe since Amos was from Judah apparently or whatever, but Israel fell before Judah, maybe somebody went in afterwards and said, oh, this is what Amos was saying. He was looking at Israel, maybe? Since Israel fell, like, right after Amos prophesied.
Right, so going back and putting, are you saying that
He said it for Judah.
that Amos was originally for Judah and they went back in and said for Israel?
Right, well, that's what you said. Remember,
Well,
Amos lived in Judah.
No, well, he's originally from, but he spends most of his time talking about Samaria and Bethel. It's most likely that he spent his time up here, right? Because this is the important thing to kind of remember. It's like, yes, we do have this kind of tension of people kind of going back in and adding these things. We also have times where the biblical editors left in prophecies that didn't come true. Right? So there's this tension of like, let's make this relevant. Let's just make sure we're preserving this person's words, even though they didn't happen. But because the prophets were very much speaking to people in order to speak into a situation, to call them to repentance, to call them to change, to point out what's happening, it's very likely that when we're reading these prophetic books and they're talking about Bethel and Samaria and these things, that they're speaking to those people in that place. Does that make sense? So it's very likely that Amos, because all the prophecies we have from him deal with Israel, that he is up there prophesying these things in Israel. Especially because we only have one or two instances where he mentions Judah, and they're pretty fleeting, right? That Judah section is thrown in the midst of all these other nations, right? So it's more likely that he's kind of here from Tekoa and coming in.
I just think it's convenient for him to prophesy Israel's gonna fall, and then just a couple decades or whatever later, it just so happens that and then what you said, nobody saw it coming or whatever, and then he says this, and maybe I was just thinking that maybe somebody kind of adjusted it to make it look like Amos had it right all along or something.
It's possible. I think the biblical editors are much less likely to go in and make those kinds of very significant changes than they are to mostly preserve and make additions. I think it's much less likely that they're going to go through the whole book of Amos and change city names and all this kind of stuff and go through that kind of length to make Amos talk about a different place. Yeah, but it's a good point. And that's the thing that makes studying a lot of these books difficult. Because there's just a lot of theories about, what was the original of this? What did it originally look like? What state is it in now? And what kind of changes were there between those two? Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer. And speaking to that, as far as additions go, the last little chunk of Amos is the only part of the book, I think it's 4 or 5 verses, that there's any hope, that there's any happiness in Amos whatsoever. And so then we get the question, is this hope kind of added in later, or is this integral and native to Amos's thought, right? Can we say that this prophet, who is very much a prophet of doom, I mean, if you want a prophet of doom, Amos is your go-to kind of guy. is it possible that this prophet of doom is going to just say all these things and then kind of have this like nice little word of hope at the end? Or is it easier to see, okay, this is kind of this later addition providing hope to people who are kind of using or looking to Amos for prophetic insight? Do you have a question, Donna?
Comment.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, question. How do we know that some of the prophecies did not come true? I mean, it may not have come true at that point, but there were some prophecies that were earlier that didn't come true for hundreds of years later. So even if they were speaking culturally and I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Anyway, because it was speaking to the people of that time period. Some of those prophecies may have not exactly been for that time period. Right.
Well, you have prophecies that mention very specific kingdoms and rulers, and those things just like didn't happen. But what's interesting, it's interesting, like in the same way that we have the biblical editors kind of keeping in multiple accounts of things and kind of weaving those together, I don't think the biblical editors saw those kind of prophecies that didn't come true as something they needed to like hide. It's interesting to me that the editors, knowing these things didn't happen, left them in.
Do you know an example of that, like off the top of your head?
Not off the top of my head.
Okay, I was just wondering.
It's conflicts going on today in places like Israel and Syria that's directly related.
It's true. This is where we need to be careful because, like, kind of like we watched like the nuclear thing. There's a lot of people that talk about, you know, like I think it's Gog and Magog in the book of Ezekiel. They're like, oh, this is Russia. You know, this is not going to be really. I mean, like, if we want to, again, like we said on Friday, if we want to take the biblical prophets and try to apply them to today, we need to understand how they're working and how it applies in their time first, rather than say, you know, Ezekiel was just talking about 2,500 years from his time.
Well, I did
Right.
some research on the nuclear thing, and it's true.
Oh, it's true. Oh, it's true. She's like, yeah, it's true. I found it out. I was on Wikipedia. Listen up. Awesome. Are there any questions about Amos? Like I said, we didn't really get to Hosea. Hosea, just real quick, like two seconds about Hosea. Hosea very much falls a little bit more in line with this. This is very much a little bit.
Yes.
He falls in line with the DH much more. Right? He has this marriage with a prostitute. The prostitute is very much representative of Israel. Right?
Yeah.
Remember how we talked about in the DH, there's the phrase they hoard after other gods?
Yes.
This is kind of what Hosea is playing with, is that kind of terminology and enacting, and we'll see this a lot with a lot of other prophets, this enacting of prophecy, right? In order to give a keen insight. And so, but Hosea is also up here in the northern kingdom, talking more a little bit more about the idolatry than Amos is. So